Robert Vance always had one big dream. He wanted to fly. Growing up in Ohio, flying wasn't something people around him did. But he was determined. When World War II broke out, it gave young people like him a way to serve and maybe even chase their dreams. So when he turned 18, Robert tried to join the Air Force. But by then, they weren't taking any more cadets. His dream had to wait. Instead, he got drafted into the U.S. Army and signed in on March 10, 1943, in Columbus, Ohio. He ended up in the 78th Lightning Division down in North Carolina. His job was with the weapons platoon in a rifle company. He led a light machine gun squad. It wasn't flying, but he did his duty. Still, flying was always on his mind. So when he saw another chance to apply for the cadet program, he went for it again. This time they accepted him. It was his way out of the infantry and his way into the skies. Robert began his training in radio school, but that's not where his heart was. One day, he saw a note on the bulletin board that changed everything. The Air Force needed gunners. Without thinking twice, Robert volunteered. He wanted to be in the action, up in the air, where he always dreamed of being. He trained at Tyndall Field in Florida to become a gunner, then moved up to Westover Field in Massachusetts. That's where he met the rest of the crew he'd be flying with. They started off training in B-17 bombers, but soon switched to B-24s. Robert worked as the assistant radio operator and also manned the tail turret and waist guns during missions. He was placed in the 506th Squadron, 44th Bomb Group. By early 1945, Robert and his crew were sent overseas to England. It had been nearly 2 years since he was first drafted, and now all his training was going to be put to the test in real combat. They were stationed at Shipdham, flying bombing missions over Germany. Most of the missions weren't too bad, he remembered. They targeted factories and strategic areas. By then, the German Air Force wasn't much of a threat anymore. But the anti-aircraft fire, known as flak, was everywhere. It was deadly. Robert clearly remembered flying over Berlin. The sky was full of black smoke as the flak exploded around them. They dropped their bombs and turned to head home. That's when he looked out and saw a parachute floating in the air. A German pilot, maybe, or another American. He didn't know. But seeing that man fall, drifting down into all that fire and chaos, it stayed with him. Robert hoped he made it, but deep down, he wasn't so sure. Then came March 24th, 1945, their 8th mission. It was supposed to be a supply drop to help the Allied advance through France and Germany. The crew loaded up the B-24 and flew out like usual. They dropped the supplies and started to turn back. But as they were leaving the drop zone, something big hit their plane. Robert knew it was serious right away. The front of the plane went quiet. No alarms, no voices. Just silence. Something had hit them hard, and it looked like part of the crew up front had been taken out instantly. Then someone in the back yelled that engine number 4 was on fire. Flames were coming out of the bomb bay. Louis, the waist gunner, and Robert were both in the waist section of the plane. They looked out the window and saw Sergeant Diaz, one of their own, falling from the plane. Robert never forgot the way Diaz hit the ground. It was like watching a rubber ball bounce. Some reports said Diaz had a parachute, but Robert didn't remember seeing one. He and Louis were staring right at him. It didn't look like he had a chance. And then their own plane hit the ground. The moment their plane hit the earth, everything became a blur of fire, noise, and chaos. The B-24 slammed into the ground, bounced once, hard, and then came crashing down for good. For about 50 terrifying seconds, the wreck tumbled and scraped across the earth before coming to a stop. The aircraft was still burning. The flames had followed them all the way down. Robert and Louis were lucky, if you could call it that. They were both thrown clear from the crash. Somehow, they'd been tossed out before the final explosion. They hit the ground hard but alive, dazed and bruised but breathing. Just moments after they were thrown clear, the B-24 exploded behind them, fire and metal shooting into the sky. All 7 other crew members were killed instantly. There was no time to cry. No time to think. Robert and Louis scrambled to get away from the wreckage, the heat of the flames still biting at their backs. They didn't know where they were, but they knew one thing for certain. They were deep in enemy territory. They didn't have a map. They didn't have much of a plan, but they had each other, and they had a will to survive. For the next day, the two of them moved cautiously through the countryside, trying to avoid being spotted. They stuck close to the trees, avoided roads, and stayed low. Every little sound made them jump. Every shadow looked like a soldier. Their luck ran out the next day. A group of German soldiers found them hiding in a thicket. There was nowhere to run. They were outnumbered and outgunned, so they surrendered. Hands in the air, they were pulled out and forced to march toward a nearby wooded area. That's when Robert felt the first real wave of fear hit him hard in the chest. He'd heard stories, whispers among the troops, about what some German units did to prisoners. Not all of them followed the rules. Some of them simply took soldiers into the woods and didn't bring them back out. Robert and Louis still had their .45 pistols tucked away. But when the Germans saw the guns, they demanded them. One soldier ordered Louis to disassemble his pistol. Louis did it smoothly. No problem. Then the soldier pointed again and told him to reassemble it. Louis paused. He looked confused. "I forget how," Louis said. It was a lie. They both knew it. Louis could take apart and reassemble a .45 in his sleep, blindfolded. They were trained that well. But he wasn't about to hand the enemy a working gun that might be used on him or Robert. It was a smart move. The Germans didn't press further. Instead, they handed them over to a German artillery unit hiding nearby. These soldiers weren't interested in executions. They were trying to survive the war, too, hiding out in the forest and waiting for orders. So instead of being shot, Robert and Louis were sent to a makeshift hospital nearby, not far from where they had crashed. It wasn't much of a hospital, more like a converted building with a few nurses, a couple doctors, and hardly any medicine. But they were alive. Robert had burns and bruises, and Louis had twisted his ankle during the crash. It was painful, but not deadly. While they lay in the hospital beds, Robert couldn't stop thinking about his family back in Ohio. They had no idea where he was, no idea if he was alive or dead. His parents would get the dreaded letter, "Missing in action." That letter would break their hearts. He imagined his mother crying, his father staring out the window, hoping for a miracle. A few days later, the sky above the hospital roared with the sound of planes. American planes. P-47s flew low, strafing the town, machine guns ripping through the buildings. The Germans scrambled. Robert and Louis ducked under their hospital beds, hoping the attack wouldn't hit them. But they knew one thing for sure. American forces were getting close. Soon after that, they heard the rumble of tanks and trucks moving into the town. German forces were in a panic. They were retreating, surrendering, trying to disappear. And then came the moment Robert would never forget. A jeep rolled up outside the hospital. Two men stepped out, an American sergeant and a lieutenant. They were part of the liberating force. Just like that, Robert and Louis were free. The relief Robert felt when he saw that American jeep pull up was something he couldn't even put into words. For days he had lived in fear, pain, and uncertainty, wondering if he would die in that hospital, if he would ever see his home again, or if his name would be one more listed as missing in action. But now, seeing those American uniforms, those stars on the helmets, and that confident look in the soldiers' eyes, it felt like waking up from a nightmare. The lieutenant spoke to them, calm and firm. "We've got an ambulance coming," he said. "You boys are going home." And just like that, everything changed. The ambulance picked them up not long after. Robert was loaded in carefully. He was still hurting from the crash, and his burns were raw. Louis was in better shape, at least physically, but his ankle was swollen, and the limp slowed him down. Still, they smiled through the pain. They were out of enemy hands. They were with their own again. They were taken to different hospitals. Robert ended up in Liège, Belgium, while Louis was sent to Paris. As they were loaded into separate transports, they said a quick goodbye, not knowing it would be their last face-to-face meeting for a long time. "Take care of yourself, Brooklyn," Robert said. That's what he always called Louis. Brooklyn. And Louis just nodded. "You too, Ohio." They didn't hug. They didn't need to. They had been through fire together, quite literally. That kind of bond didn't need words. In Liège, the doctors checked Robert over again. He had a few cracked ribs, a concussion, and burns along his back and shoulders. The nurses were kind but busy. The war was still going on, even if the end was near. They patched him up and kept him warm, and he slept for almost 2 days straight. His body needed it. His mind needed it more. When he finally felt strong enough to sit up, the first thing he asked for was a pencil and some paper. He wrote a letter home. He didn't bother with military formality. He wrote to his parents the way a son would, real, honest, and straight from the heart. "Dear Mom and Dad," he started. "I'm alive." He told them everything he could. About the crash, the hospital, the Americans who had rescued him. He didn't talk about Sergeant Diaz. He couldn't yet. That wound was too fresh. But he wanted them to know he was okay. He wanted them to stop crying if they were. He wanted to go home. That letter made it home before he did. Back in Ohio, the Vance family had already received the worst kind of message from the War Department. Their son, Robert Vance, was missing in action, presumed dead. His mother had collapsed when she read the words. His father, quiet and strong as he was, hadn't spoken for a whole day. They were preparing themselves for a funeral without a body. And then the letter came. His mother cried again, but this time with joy. She read the letter out loud 3 times before finally letting it go. His father folded it and put it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. Not long after that, Robert was put on a convoy ship headed back across the Atlantic. The sea was rough, but Robert didn't care. Every mile the ship moved west was a mile closer to home. He stood out on the deck sometimes, staring at the ocean, thinking about the 7 men who hadn't made it, thinking about the explosion, about the silence when the front of the plane went quiet. He didn't feel lucky. Not yet. But he did feel grateful. When the ship finally docked in Massachusetts, it was cold and gray, but to Robert, it looked like heaven. The moment his boots touched American soil, he felt something inside him relax, like a knot that had been pulled tight for months, finally letting go. And then came the best part. He was given a 60-day furlough. Robert didn't waste a minute of that 60-day furlough. The war was still fresh in his bones, the memories still raw in his mind. But what he needed more than anything was to feel normal again, to remember what peace felt like, what it meant to just be home. As soon as he reached Ohio, the train pulling into the small station near his hometown, his heart felt like it would burst. His parents were waiting for him, standing there at the edge of the platform like a photograph from a dream. His mother wore a plain coat, but her eyes sparkled with tears. His father looked older, his face tighter. But the second he saw Robert, a smile cracked through, and he rushed forward faster than Robert had ever seen him move. They didn't say anything at first. His mother threw her arms around him and cried into his jacket. His father just gripped his shoulder, his hand shaking slightly, and nodded with quiet pride. The house hadn't changed. The streets were still the same. But Robert was different now. Everything looked smaller somehow, more peaceful, more distant from the noise of engines, gunfire, and falling bombs. After a few days of catching up and sleeping in his own bed, he and his father planned a fishing trip up to northern Michigan. It had always been something they talked about before the war. But life, and then war, got in the way. This time, they made it happen. They took 2 of his father's old friends along, men who'd known Robert since he was a boy. It felt right. It felt healing. The drive up north was long but peaceful. No checkpoints, no sirens, no threats. Just open roads, fields, lakes, and the slow turn of spring thawing out the trees. When they reached their spot, a quiet, secluded lake with cabins nearby, they unpacked and set up camp. It wasn't anything fancy. They had rods, bait, a couple of boats, and a whole lot of stories. Robert didn't talk much about the war at first. He mostly listened to the older men talk about fishing trips from the past, about weather, about their grandkids. But as the days passed and the fish kept biting, he opened up a little more. One night, sitting by the fire after a long day on the lake, Robert shared the story about Louis and the pistol. The men laughed, hard. Not because it was funny, but because they understood. That moment, that smart lie, had probably saved their lives. That laughter meant something. It made Robert feel like himself again. The trip was good for him. The cold lake air, the smell of pine, the pull of the fishing line. It gave his mind a break. He even smiled more than he expected. They caught a lot of fish, too, big ones. His dad said it was the best trip they'd ever taken. Still, at night when the wind quieted and the campfire burned low, Robert sometimes saw flashes of that day in March. The engine on fire, the bomb bay bursting into flames, Diaz falling, the ground coming up fast. It didn't go away. It just got quieter. When they returned to Ohio, Robert felt better. Not fixed, but steadier. He began the slow process of figuring out what came next. The war was winding down. Everyone could feel it. The newspapers were full of Allied victories. Hitler was cornered. The end was near. But for Robert, that didn't mean everything went back to normal. He wasn't the same kid who dreamed of flying in a quiet Ohio town. He'd lived it now. He'd seen the sky from the belly of a bomber, and the earth from the wreckage of a crash. And the war had taken his crew. 7 names he could still say in his sleep. Men he laughed with, fought beside, and lost in a single moment. He didn't talk much about them, but he remembered every one. Robert's days back home slowly settled into a quiet rhythm. He wasn't in uniform anymore, but the war still lived inside him. People around town treated him like a hero. Handshakes from old neighbors, nods from men at the diner. Even the local school teacher asked him to come speak to the students. But Robert wasn't sure how to feel about it. He had survived, yes, but the ones who didn't, Diaz, the pilot, the rest of his crew, they weren't coming back. The weight of that truth stayed on his shoulders every single day. Sometimes, in the middle of a conversation, his mind would drift off. He'd see the smoke. He'd hear the crack of flak bursting in the air. And always, he'd see Diaz falling, bouncing off the ground like he was made of rubber. That image haunted him more than anything. He didn't talk about it with his parents. They were just glad he was alive. His mother tried to keep him busy, always cooking, always asking if he needed something. His father spent more time than usual just sitting with him on the porch, smoking in silence. It was like they understood that some wounds were quiet ones. One afternoon, Robert found a letter in the mail with unfamiliar handwriting. He opened it slowly, curious, and immediately smiled. It was from Louis. "Hey, Ohio," it started. Louis wrote from a hospital in Paris. He told Robert he was doing fine, his ankle was healing, and he'd be back in Brooklyn before long. The letter was full of sarcasm and old jokes, just like Louis had always been. He even wrote, "Remember that crash? I told you I hated flying with you." Robert laughed out loud. The first real laugh in weeks. He sat down that same night and wrote back. They continued to exchange letters now and then. They both said they'd meet up again someday, maybe visit each other's city. But life had its way of stretching the days and pulling people in different directions. The war was ending, and the country was changing fast. People were looking forward, starting families, rebuilding. Robert didn't rush into anything. He took things slow. His body healed. But he still walked with a stiffness in his shoulders, a kind of caution in how he moved through the world. Crowds made him nervous. Loud bangs made his heart skip. It was like his brain was still in survival mode, even though the war was done. The government sent him a few medals in the mail. He didn't frame them. He put them in a small box in his drawer. They felt like reminders of something he couldn't forget, even if he wanted to. Still, there were good moments. He got a job helping at a local radio repair shop. It wasn't flying, but he liked it. It kept his hands busy, and the hum of the radios brought back something familiar from the skies. Every so often, he'd fix up a shortwave and tune into foreign voices. Sometimes French, sometimes German. It didn't scare him anymore. It just reminded him of how big the world was. One evening, sitting by the window as the sun dipped low, Robert opened his notebook and began writing down the names of his crewmates. He wrote them slowly, carefully, one after another. Then he added small memories next to each name. Diaz always sang off-key but wouldn't stop. Captain Price, calm even when the flak was thick. Tommy never flew without his lucky socks. They were more than names on a report. They were real, and Robert didn't want the world to forget them. That night, for the first time in a long time, he slept without dreams. Spring melted into summer, and the headlines grew louder with hope. By May 1945, Germany had surrendered. Victory in Europe. People flooded the streets. There were parades, fireworks, music on every corner. The whole country seemed to breathe again. But for Robert, it was different. He didn't rush outside with flags or join the cheering crowds downtown. He stood on his porch that day, hands in his pockets, watching the neighborhood kids ride their bikes like nothing had ever happened. He was glad the war was over. Truly glad. But it didn't bring back the men who never made it home. A week later, he walked down to the post office and picked up another letter. This time it wasn't from Louis. It was from the War Department. Inside was a small, formal envelope. He opened it right there on the steps. It was a confirmation that he had been awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross and the Purple Heart for injuries sustained in combat. He stared at the words. There was no ceremony, no applause, just a typed letter. He folded it up and slipped it into his shirt pocket. That evening, after supper, he handed the letter to his father without a word. His father read it slowly, then handed it back. "You earned it," he said. Nothing more, nothing less. Robert knew those medals weren't just his. They belonged to the whole crew, the ones who dropped with him through the smoke, who didn't walk away from the crash. And to him, no medal could equal that sacrifice. Later that week, he went to the local cemetery, even though none of his crew was buried there. He walked between the rows of graves, found a quiet patch of grass under a tree, and sat down. He didn't pray. He didn't speak. He just sat there, thinking about each man, their voices, their laughter, the tension in the air before a mission, the taste of cold air at 20,000 feet, the silence after the bombs dropped. That silence, he could still feel it. By August, word came that Japan had surrendered. The war was officially over. There was peace across the globe. But Robert had already begun another war, the one inside. Some nights he would wake up in a cold sweat, heart racing, the memory of falling from the sky jolting him upright. Other nights he'd stare at the ceiling, unable to sleep at all. But through it all, he carried on. He worked, he smiled when people talked to him, and he tried to live each day with purpose. One Saturday, walking home from work, he passed a small community center where a few other veterans gathered. They invited him in. At first, he declined. He wasn't ready. But after a few steps, he turned around and walked back. Inside, the room was filled with quiet men who looked a lot like him. Strong shoulders, tired eyes. One of them offered him a coffee and asked where he served. Robert told him. The man nodded and said, "You made it back. That counts for something." Over the weeks, Robert found comfort there. They didn't have to explain the weight they carried. It hung in the air like smoke, understood without words. Then, one evening, someone brought up a strange topic. What to do now? After everything they had seen, after everything they had lost, What did the rest of life look like? Some talked about school, others about marriage. A few just wanted to forget. Robert didn't know yet. He only knew one thing. He had been given a second chance, and he didn't want to waste it. Fall rolled in, and with it came a quiet shift in Robert's heart. The leaves began to change, and so did something inside him. For the first time since the war ended, he found himself thinking not just about what had happened, but about what could still come. He started taking longer walks around town, letting his thoughts stretch further than they had in months. The streets were familiar, but the way he looked at them had changed. Every little thing, the sound of kids playing, the smell of fresh bread from the bakery, even the wind brushing through the trees, seemed more meaningful now. He'd been close to death, closer than most, and now every ordinary day felt like a quiet kind of miracle. One afternoon, he stopped by a small diner on Main Street. It was a place he used to visit before the war, back when life was simpler. He sat down at the counter and ordered a cup of black coffee. The waitress, a young woman named Helen, smiled at him and said, "You look like you've seen the whole world." Robert gave a tired smile back. Seen too much of it, maybe. She didn't ask questions, just poured the coffee and gave him space. But something about her kindness, her soft voice, her calm eyes, got to him. Over the next few weeks, he returned again and again. They talked more each time, about little things, about the weather, about music, about fishing. Helen never pushed him to talk about the war. That's why he kept coming back. One evening, after the diner had closed, they sat outside under the awning, sharing a cigarette. She finally asked, "Do you miss it?" He didn't answer at first. Then he said, "I miss the people. Not the war." That was all he had to say. She understood. They started seeing each other after that, slowly, gently. It wasn't some big romantic whirlwind. Robert wasn't looking to be saved. He just wanted to feel normal again. And Helen, with her steady way of listening, her laugh that came out like a breeze, helped him take small steps forward. Still, the past didn't stay buried. One day, a package arrived in the mail. No return address, just a plain brown envelope. Inside was a small photo, faded, black and white. It was their crew, standing together in front of the B-24 before their first mission. Robert stared at it for a long time. He traced each face with his eyes. There they were, laughing, young, alive. Louis had sent it. On the back was a short note. "Still miss him every day. Thought you should have a copy, too." Brooklyn, Robert tucked the photo into a small frame and placed it on his nightstand. Every morning, he looked at it. Every night before bed, he nodded to them, his brothers, his ghosts. He started writing more after that. Not letters, just memories. He filled a notebook with their stories, each page like a tribute to the ones who never made it home. He didn't know if anyone would read it, but it didn't matter. It was for them, and maybe for himself, too. Helen read a few pages one night while he was out back working on the radio. When he came inside, she looked at him and said, "You should share this someday." "Maybe," Robert said, "when I'm ready." That winter, the first snow fell gently across the town. Robert stood on the porch again, just like he had when the war ended. Only this time, he didn't feel distant. He felt present, grounded. He still carried the weight. He always would. But now, it wasn't a burden that held him down. It was a reminder of why he had to keep living, not just for himself, but for all of them. The years passed quietly, like the slow drift of snow across a frozen lake. Life didn't rush Robert. It eased forward, day by day, season by season. And though the war remained etched deep into his bones, he found a kind of peace in routine, in relationships, and in remembering without being crushed by it. He and Helen eventually married, not with any big ceremony or fuss, just a small church wedding with close family and a few of Robert's old army friends. Louis couldn't make it. He sent a telegram from Brooklyn saying, "Make sure she knows you snore like a tank." Robert smiled at that. Married life was gentle. They bought a modest house not far from where Robert had grown up. Helen worked part-time at the library, and Robert opened his own little radio repair shop. Business wasn't always booming, but he liked the work. Fixing broken things made sense to him. It was quiet, careful, and patient. And sometimes, when he was working alone, he'd hum the songs Diaz used to butcher back in the barracks, just to remember. He kept the photo of the crew on a shelf behind the counter. Some customers asked about it. Most didn't. But when they did, Robert would smile and say, "That's my other family." He and Louis stayed in touch through letters for years. They talked about baseball, about how fast the world was changing, about aches and age creeping up on them. They never had to say much about the crash anymore. It had become a silent thread between them, always there, but rarely tugged on. Eventually, Louis passed away. It hit Robert harder than he expected. He was the last one now, the only one left from their crew. That night, he sat by the window long after Helen had gone to bed. The house was quiet. The streets outside were still, and he whispered each of their names again, one by one. It wasn't grief, it was remembrance, love even, a kind of promise that as long as he breathed, they wouldn't be forgotten. Later in life, Robert was invited to speak at a local school for Veterans Day. At first, he declined, but after some nudging from Helen, he agreed. He stood in front of a room full of teenagers who knew nothing of war beyond movies and textbooks. He didn't talk about heroism or medals. He talked about friendship, about loss, about watching the sun rise from 20,000 feet, knowing any mission could be your last. He told them about Diaz, about the silence that came after the bombs dropped, about surviving when others didn't. And then he said, the hardest part wasn't the crash. It was coming home and realizing the people you loved weren't coming back with you. But you carry them every day. You live in their name. That's what being a survivor means. When he finished, the room was silent. And that silence, for once, felt like peace. In his final years, Robert never stopped writing. He filled notebooks with stories, not just about war, but about small moments, good moments, fishing trips, laughing until your sides hurt, hot coffee on a cold morning, the way the sky looked just before a mission. And when his time came, years later, his wife found that first photo still framed on his nightstand. He was buried with a small U.S. flag, his name etched in stone. The medals he never once boasted about, mentioned briefly on a bronze plaque. But those who knew him remembered something else. A quiet man, a survivor, a friend, a man who came home carrying the memories of those who didn't, and who lived every day as if their stories mattered. Because they did, and always would.